I pulled my pickup truck into the gravel driveway of my custom-built stone residence on Oak Ridge Road, expecting nothing more than the quiet rustle of autumn leaves. Instead, I found a 30-foot moving van backed up to my front porch. Workers were hauling leather couches, flat-screen televisions, and racks of clothes right through my front door. Standing on the porch, holding a clipboard and barking orders like she owned the place, was my 32-year-old daughter-in-law, Jessica. Next to her, leaning against the cedar railing with a mug of my favorite dark roast, stood my son, Brandon. I turned off the ignition, sat in the silence of the cab for a long moment, and closed my eyes. At 67 years old, after 40 years of running my own commercial carpentry company, building houses for half the county, I thought I had seen every kind of shock imaginable. I was wrong. I stepped out of the truck, the cool breeze catching my jacket, and walked up the stone steps I had laid with my own hands 30 years ago. "Brandon," I said quietly, keeping my voice level, "what is going on here?" Brandon turned around, smiling with a bizarre, rehearsed warmth that made my stomach turn. He took a slow sip from my mug. "Dad, you're back early from your fishing trip. Great timing. Look, we have huge news. We decided it was finally time to make a big life upgrade. We moved in." I stared at him, trying to process the absolute absurdity of his words. "You moved in? Without asking me? Without calling me?" Jessica stepped forward, tapping her designer pen against her clipboard, her eyes scanning my rustic, sprawling, four-bedroom house with an expression that looked far more like a commercial appraisal than family affection. "Thomas, don't be dramatic. Your knees have been bothering you, and this 4,000-square-foot house is far too big for one lonely widower. Brandon and I discussed it, and it just makes total financial sense for the family. We gave up our apartment rental, we're taking the master suite upstairs, and we set up the ground-floor guest bedroom for you. No more stairs to worry about." "You set up the guest room for me?" I asked, a cold knot tightening in my chest. "In my own home?" "It's for your own good, Dad," Brandon added, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. "We're going to take care of you. You don't have to worry about maintenance, property taxes, or living alone anymore. We're a family again." I looked at my son, the boy I had sent to private college, the young man whose debts I had cleared twice, the son I had loved unconditionally since the day his mother, Martha, passed away 8 years ago. I wanted to believe he was just being naive, just acting out of misguided affection. But as I looked past him into the foyer, I saw my late wife's hand-carved oak dining table pushed into the garage corner, covered in dusty moving blankets, replaced by a cheap modern glass set. My heart didn't break in that moment. It froze. I didn't scream. I didn't throw their boxes off the porch. 40 years in construction had taught me one fundamental rule. When a structure is compromised, you don't start swinging a hammer wildly. You inspect the foundation, find out what's really holding it up, and make your move with absolute precision. "All right," I said softly, looking Brandon straight in the eye. "Let's unload your things." Brandon grinned, looking relieved, thinking he had broken my spirit with a single conversation. "Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd see reason." He had no idea that my compliance was a lie. I needed time. I needed to understand how my own blood could walk into my sanctuary, push my wife's memory into the garage, and assign me to a guest bedroom like an unwanted tenant. That evening, the house was filled with noise, a sharp, chaotic contrast to the peaceful quiet I had cherished for nearly a decade. Jessica was already giving orders to a painter on her cell phone, talking about knocking down the load-bearing wall between the kitchen and the sunroom to create an open-concept entertaining space. I sat on the edge of the small bed in the downstairs guest room, staring at the painted drywall. I opened my wallet, pulled out a faded photograph of Martha standing on the bare concrete foundation of this house back in 1994, beaming at the camera while holding a carpenter's pencil. We had built this place dollar by dollar, board by board, sacrifice by sacrifice. At 10:30 p.m., after the house grew quiet and Brandon and Jessica were asleep in my master bedroom upstairs, I slipped out into the hallway in my socks. I walked down to the kitchen to fetch a glass of water, but as I passed Brandon's temporary folding desk near the study, I noticed his laptop was open, casting a pale blue light across a stack of official-looking papers. I didn't intend to snoop, but a bold header on the top document caught my eye in the dim light. Commercial refinance application and deed of transfer. My pulse began to race. I picked up the paper, holding my breath. It wasn't a lease agreement. It wasn't a family cohabitation form. It was a pre-approved loan application for $750,000 filed by Brandon and Jessica using the Oak Ridge Road residence as primary collateral. Attached to the back was a forged power of attorney affidavit bearing what looked like my signature, dated 3 months prior.
My hands began to shake. Not with fear, but with a deep, crushing sorrow. Brandon hadn't moved into my house to take care of his aging father. He had moved in because he was drowning in debt, and he needed physical possession of the property to convince a private equity lender that he was the rightful owner and manager of the estate. I carefully set the paper back down, exactly as I had found it. I went back to the guest room, sat on the bed, and stared into the dark for 4 long hours. How had it come to this? When Brandon was 24, he started a luxury auto import business that went under in 18 months. I covered his $120,000 loss out of my retirement fund, telling him that family comes first. 2 years ago, when Jessica wanted to start an online fashion boutique, I gave them another $45,000 as a gift. I had spent my entire life building a safety net for them, and instead of learning to fly, they had simply learned to consume the net itself. The next morning, I woke up early, before the sun rose. I put on my work boots, poured a cup of black coffee, and drove straight to town to meet my oldest friend, Samuel Vance. Samuel was 69, a retired county clerk and real estate attorney who had closed every land deal I had ever made over the last 35 years. We met at our usual diner booth, the smell of fried eggs and fresh coffee hanging in the air. Samuel listened quietly as I laid out the scene: the moving truck, the guest room assignment, the forged power of attorney, and the $750,000 loan application. When I finished, Samuel took off his wire-rimmed glasses, rubbed his eyes, and let out a long, heavy sigh. "Thomas, I knew something was wrong 2 weeks ago, but I didn't want to bring it up until I had full confirmation." I leaned forward, my fingers tightening around my coffee mug. "What are you talking about, Samuel?" "Brandon came into the county records office 3 weeks ago," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a low, painful whisper. "He was asking about the tax history on the Oak Ridge property. He wanted to know if there were any secondary liens or homestead exemptions that would prevent a fast title transfer." "Did he file that forged power of attorney with the county?" I asked, my heart pounding in my ears. "He tried to," Samuel replied, "but the clerk flagged it because the notary seal looked suspicious. Thomas, your son isn't just broke, he's desperate. I ran a quiet title search through my old contacts. Brandon and Jessica filed for corporate bankruptcy on their boutique business last winter. They owe over $400,000 to high-interest private lenders. If they don't secure assets fast, those lenders are going to take everything they have, including their cars, their accounts, and their personal credit." The truth hit me like a physical punch to the chest. It was all a theatrical production. The caring children, the lonely widower narrative, the ground floor guest room for my bad knees. It was all a calculated, manipulative mask designed to keep me quiet, compliant, and out of the way while they liquidated the house I had spent my life building. "What do I do, Samuel?" I asked, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. "Do I call the police on my own son? Do I put him in prison?" Samuel looked at me with deep, genuine pity. "If you report the forgery, Thomas, he could face federal fraud charges. But if you do nothing, he will sign those papers, steal the title out from under you, and throw you out the moment the lender hands over the cash." I sat in that diner booth for a long time, watching the morning traffic roll past the window. I thought about the days I spent working in the freezing winter rain, framing houses, building a life for a family that was now treating me like a stepping stone. "There has to be another way," I said quietly. "I won't let him ruin my life, but I need him to face the truth of what he's become. I need him to see it with his own eyes." "Then you have to play along for a few more days," Samuel advised. "Let them think they are in complete control. Let them schedule their final meeting with the private equity lender. The moment they think they've won is the only moment they will drop their guard entirely." I returned to the house that afternoon acting completely oblivious. I played the tired, confused old father. When Jessica loudly complained that my old work boots near the door were ruining the aesthetic of the entry hall, I apologized softly and moved them to the shed. When Brandon told me he was going to hire a crew to remove my late wife's perennial flower garden to build a paved 3-car parking pad, I simply nodded and said, "If you think that's best, son." I watched Jessica's eyes light up with arrogant satisfaction every time I surrendered. She believed I was weak. She believed age had softened my brain and broken my resolve. She mistook my patience for surrender. On Thursday morning, the emotional stakes escalated to a point I didn't think I could survive. I walked out to the backyard shed to retrieve my carpentry tools, the original hand planes, chisels, and leather belts I had saved for 40 years, intending to pass them down to my future grandchildren. The shed lock was cut off, lying on the grass. Inside, the wooden tool chests were completely empty. I rushed back into the house, my heart hammering against my ribs. Brandon was sitting at the kitchen island, eating toast while scrolling through his phone. "Brandon," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady, "where are my tools? Where are my father's hand saws?"
Brandon didn't even look up from his screen. "Oh yeah, I had a clearance guy come by this morning. He bought the whole lot for $1,200. We needed to clear the shed out anyway to make room for Jessica's Peloton bike and home gym setup." $1,200. Tools worth tens of thousands of dollars in craftsmanship and sentimental value. Tools that my own father had handed to me when I was 18 years old, sold off for pocket change to fund a gym setup. "You sold my father's tools?" I whispered, the room spinning around me. "Dad, come on," Brandon sighed, tossing his phone onto the counter and looking at me with exasperated annoyance. "They were sitting there gathering dust. You haven't taken on a contract in 3 years. You don't need them anymore. We're trying to modernize this property so it actually has value. Stop clinging to old junk." That was the exact moment the father in me died, and the man who built Oak Ridge took his place. I didn't yell. I didn't shed a single tear in front of him. I took a deep breath, looked at my son's arrogant, unbothered face, and nodded slowly. "You're right, Brandon. Old things lose their value when people don't know how to respect them." I walked back to my guest room, locked the door, and called Samuel. "Set up the meeting," I told him. "Whenever Brandon has his lender coming to the house to sign the final papers, I want you there, and I want the buyer there too." Samuel paused on the line. "The buyer, Thomas? Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said, staring at the photograph of Martha. "It's time to finish this." The climax came on Saturday afternoon at 2 p.m. Brandon and Jessica had orchestrated what they believed was their ultimate victory celebration. They had invited Mr. Harrison, a senior executive from a high-yield private equity firm downtown, along with a mobile notary, to finalize the property management and equity transfer agreement right in my living room. They had even set out a spread of expensive wine, cheeses, and catering, funded undoubtedly by another credit card they couldn't afford. They wore tailored suits, beaming with absolute arrogance, acting like wealthy estate owners granting an audience to a bank officer. I sat quietly in the wing-back chair in the corner of the living room, wearing my old flannel shirt and work jeans, looking like a forgotten relic in my own home. "Mr. Harrison," Brandon said smoothly, pouring a glass of Pinot Noir for the lender. "As you can see, the property is in pristine condition. 400 acres of prime timberland, a custom stone residence, completely unencumbered by any primary bank mortgage. My father, Thomas, has officially stepped back from property management due to his advancing age and health issues. We are ready to sign the equity line agreements today." Mr. Harrison, a sharp, gray-haired man in a three-piece suit, adjusted his glasses and looked through the thick stack of legal contracts on the coffee table. "And Mr. Thomas Vance has fully executed the title transfer documents and power of attorney?" "Oh, absolutely," Jessica chimed in with her sweetest, most convincing smile. "Thomas is right over there. He's very comfortable with us taking over the financial burden. Aren't you, Thomas?" They both looked over at me, their eyes flashing with a silent, icy warning. "Keep your mouth shut, play the confused old man, and let us get the money." Before I could speak, the heavy oak front door opened. Samuel Vance stepped into the foyer, holding a thick leather briefcase. Behind him walked a tall, distinguished woman in her mid-50s, wearing a charcoal business suit, carrying her own tablet and legal binder. Brandon's smile instantly froze. He stood up from the couch, his posture stiffening with sudden agitation. "Samuel, what are you doing here? This is a private financial meeting." "It certainly is a financial meeting, Brandon," Samuel said calmly, stepping into the living room and nodding respectfully to Mr. Harrison. "But as the long-standing legal counsel of the Oak Ridge estate, I felt it was my duty to ensure all parties had accurate information before any fraud was committed in this room." Jessica's face flushed bright red. "Fraud? How dare you? Get out of our house before I call the police."
"Your house?" Samuel asked, raising an eyebrow with icy precision. He turned to the distinguished woman beside him. "Allow me to introduce Miss Evelyn Reed, Senior Chief Counsel for the Washington Land Preservation Trust." Brandon blinked, looking wildly between Samuel, the woman, and me. "Land Preservation Trust? What the hell is going on here?" I stood up slowly from my chair. The quiet, tired old man was gone. I stood tall, my shoulders back, looking at my son with the calm, immovable authority of a man who had laid every stone beneath his feet. "Brandon," I said softly, my voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the living room, "you moved your family into this house 5 days ago without asking me. You pushed your mother's furniture into the garage. You put me in a guest bedroom. You sold my father's tools for pocket change. And you brought a lender into this room to mortgage a house you thought belonged to me." "It does belong to you," Brandon shouted, his composure completely shattering as panic flared in his eyes. "And as your son, I have a right to manage this asset to save my family from financial ruin. You're selfish, Dad. You're sitting on millions of dollars while your own son is drowning." "I was sitting on millions of dollars, Brandon," I replied quietly. I stepped over to the coffee table, picked up Miss Evelyn Reed's legal binder, and laid it directly in front of Mr. Harrison, the private equity lender. "Mr. Harrison," I said calmly, "my son is trying to offer you this house as collateral for a $750,000 loan, but he failed to do one very basic piece of due diligence. Mr. Harrison looked up, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. What due diligence, Mr. Vance? He never checked to see who actually owned this house. A suffocating, dead silence fell over the living room. Jessica stopped breathing. Brandon's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Miss Evelyn Reed stepped forward, touching the legal binder. 6 months ago, Mr. Thomas Vance legally sold the entire 400-acre Oak Ridge property and this stone residence to the Washington Land Preservation Trust for a structured life estate grant. Brandon went deathly pale. He sold it?
The sale was finalized in March, Ms. Reed continued smoothly, her voice crisp and indisputable. Mr. Vance donated 50% of the land's value as a protected wilderness conservancy in memory of his late wife, Martha Vance. The remaining $3.2 million was placed into an irrevocable, fully protected private trust fund that pays Thomas a lifetime annuity, with the remainder slated for environmental scholarships upon his passing. She looked directly at Brandon and Jessica with cold professional disdain. Under the terms of the deed, Thomas Vance holds a protected lifetime tenancy clause. He has the absolute, exclusive right to occupy this residence until his final breath. However, Ms. Reed opened a second section of the binder and pulled out a stamped county document. The deed explicitly strictly forbids any unauthorized third-party residency, unapproved structural modifications, or secondary commercial encumbrances. As of 6 months ago, Thomas Vance does not hold the legal title to sell or mortgage this house, and neither do you. Mr. Harrison stared at the documents, then looked up at Brandon with an expression of absolute fury. He slowly closed his laptop, stood up, and gathered his papers. "You brought me out here to sign a fraudulent mortgage on a house owned by a land trust?" Mr. Harrison said, his voice dripping with anger. "You forged a power of attorney on property that isn't even in your father's name anymore?" "No, wait, Mr. Harrison, please!" Jessica shrieked, tears of sheer panic finally bursting from her eyes as she grabbed the lender's arm. "It's a misunderstanding. We can fix this. We can work something out." "Touch me again, and I will have my legal team file corporate fraud and criminal attempted grand larceny charges against both of you by 5 p.m. today," Mr. Harrison snapped, pulling his arm away with utter disgust. He looked at me, gave a brief, respectful nod, and walked out the front door, slamming it behind him. The heavy sound of the door closing echoed like a gavel in a courtroom. Jessica collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands, weeping hysterically as her dreams of $750,000 bailout evaporated into thin air. Brandon stood frozen in the middle of the room, looking at me like I was a complete stranger. The arrogance, the entitlement, the smug authority he had displayed for the past 5 days had vanished completely, leaving behind a terrified, broken boy standing in the ruins of his own greed.
"Dad?" Brandon choked out, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his cheeks. You sold the house. You gave it away to a trust? Why would you do that to me? I'm your son, your only child." I walked over to him, stopping just 2 feet away. I looked into his eyes, searching for any remnant of the little boy I used to hold on my shoulders while framing roofs in the summer sun. "I spent 40 years building a safety net for you, Brandon," I said, my voice steady, filled with a deep, permanent sorrow. "Every time you failed, I picked you up. Every time you spent money you didn't have, I wrote a check. I thought I was helping you, but all I was doing was teaching you that my hard work was yours to consume." "Dad, please." Brandon fell to his knees right there on the rug, grabbing my hand, sobbing openly.
They're going to take our cars. They're going to declare us bankrupt. We have nowhere to go. Please, Dad, you have the trust money. Help us. Just give us enough to pay off the lenders." I looked down at my son, feeling the final, agonizing tear in my heart. I gently, firmly pulled my hand out of his grip. "If I write you another check, Brandon, I won't be saving you. I'll just be paying for your next lie. I protected this land so it will stay green and quiet forever in your mother's name. That is my legacy, not your debt." I looked over at Samuel, who pulled a formal legal notice from his briefcase. "You have 48 hours to remove your moving van, your furniture, and your personal belongings from this property," Samuel said quietly to Brandon. "If you are still here on Monday morning at 9 o'clock, the Sheriff's Department will execute a formal trespass eviction under the Land Preservation Trust agreement." Jessica looked up, her mascara running down her face, her eyes wide with shock. 48 hours? Where are we supposed to go?" "That is no longer my concern," I said quietly. I turned my back on them, walked down the hallway, and stepped into my quiet ground-floor room. I picked up my jacket, stepped out the back door, and walked down the path toward the woods behind the house. For the next 2 days, the sound of moving trucks and desperate, tearful arguments echoed through the stone residence on Oak Ridge Road. I didn't participate. I stayed in the barn, helping my old neighbor repair his tractor, keeping my mind focused on work, on survival, on peace.
On Monday morning at 9:15 a.m., I walked back up the gravel driveway. The moving van was gone. The luxury cars were gone. The glass dining table was gone. The house was completely silent. I walked up the front steps, pushed open the heavy oak door, and stepped into the tall, sunlit foyer. My late wife's hand-carved oak dining table had been brought back inside from the garage, sitting exactly where it belonged, in the center of the room. Dust wiped clean, shining under the warm morning light. Brandon had moved it back before you left, his one final, silent admission of shame. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a single cup of black coffee, and walked out onto the back porch. The sun was rising high over the 400 acres of protected oak trees, their leaves blazing with bright reds, golds, and oranges in the crisp autumn air. The land stretched out to the horizon, silent, safe, and unbroken. I sat down in my wooden rocking chair, taking a slow sip of the hot coffee, feeling the cool mountain wind against my face. I had saved my home. I had protected my wife's memory. I had secured my dignity and my peace for the rest of my days. I looked out over the quiet forest, a single tear slipping down my weathered cheek, disappearing into the color of my flannel shirt. I had saved everything I built, but as I listened to the hollow silence of the big, empty house behind me, I realized that some foundations, once broken by the people you love, can never be rebuilt again.